Hi, everybody. So today, as you all know, we're going to be discussing social equity and criminal justice reform in the cannabis space, particularly against the backdrop of New York's imminent legalization, which we're hearing should be happening either by the end of this year or early next year. So to have a very in-depth discussion about what we think should be included in any legalization bill in New York, as well as in the tri-state area, I have some very incredibly talented and accomplished people joining me today. We have Shaleen Title, who is the Cannabis Control Commissioner in Massachusetts. We have Jason Ortiz, who is the board president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. We have Joseph Bondy, who is a criminal defense and corporate cannabis attorney in Manhattan. And we have Lauren Rudick, who is a partner at Hiller PC, and as well as a prominent cannabis attorney in the New York legal space. I'm going to be going through a more in-depth bio for each of our wonderful guests today. But I did want to start off by saying that my name is Fatima Afia. I'm an attorney here at Hiller PC, and I'm a graduate of Brooklyn Law School. I have experience at Hiller PC representing clients in land use and zoning matters, as well as our business and commercial litigation matters and employment disability insurance law. But I actually got involved in the cannabis space in 2017 as part of the pro bono legal team behind the lawsuit titled Marvin versus Barr, Washington versus Barr. And that is a presently pending lawsuit that is challenging the constitutionality of our federal cannabis laws in the United States. We're actually headed to the Supreme Court this year, which is really exciting. And since joining that pro bono legal team, I have been working as an advocate on behalf of minority-owned businesses in the Massachusetts legal market. And I've also been writing and preparing and supporting the preparation of state license applications in the state of Massachusetts in particular. So I'm going to start off by introducing Shaleen Title, who is a drug policy activist and attorney who currently serves as one of 5 commissioners on the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, the agency that is tasked with regulating legal and medical marijuana in the Commonwealth. Shaleen holds a business degree, a law degree, and a graduate degree in accounting from the University of Illinois, and she was previously a part of the multi-state tax group of Deloitte Tax. Shaleen has successfully led the implementation and development of Massachusetts' social equity program under the state's adult use licensing framework. She has been named in the Boston Business Journal's 2018 list as one of the 50 most powerful people in Boston. She's described as the people's weed watchdog in Boston Magazine's 2019 Power List, and she has won several awards for her advocacy work and her efforts to make the cannabis industry more fair and inclusive. Next up, we have Jason Ortiz, who is the board president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, the first 501c6 trade association and a nonprofit business league created specifically to progress the cannabis industry by increasing diversity, with a mission of creating equal access for cannabis businesses and promoting economic empowerment for communities of color. Jason has a bachelor's degree in public and community engagement from the University of Connecticut. He has been fighting to end the war on drugs since he first heard the words school to prison pipeline, which we will be talking about more later. He has worked on a number of progressive campaigns, both issue-based and electoral, with victories electing strong progressives to the school board of Durham, North Carolina, and changing drug policy law in Connecticut. Jason has been named one of the 20 outstanding Black and Latinx men leading change in cannabis by Green Entrepreneur. Next up, we have Joseph Bondy, who is, as I mentioned before, a criminal defense and corporate cannabis attorney in Manhattan. Over the past 25 years, he has represented dozens of federal and state cannabis clients at all stages of litigation. Joe has tried cannabis cases to verdict and won reductions from the federal sentencing guidelines for cannabis defendants on multiple occasions. Joe has been named as one of the top 100 criminal trial lawyers by the American College of Trial Lawyers and one of the nation's preeminent cannabis attorneys by High Times Magazine. Joe is a member of the pro bono legal team in the Washington versus Barr lawsuit that Hiller PC is bringing alongside him. He's also the board, vice president, and board of directors of the Cannabis Cultural Association, one of the plaintiffs in the Washington versus Barr lawsuit, and a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York, which helps marginalized and underrepresented communities engage in the legal cannabis industry. He's also a board of directors of National Normal and a member of the National Legal Committee of Normal. He is presently lead counsel to Lev Parnas in a federal election act fraud case pending, which is in the Southern District of New York. and he's a faculty member at Cardozo Law School's Intensive Trial Advocacy Program. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Lauren Rudick, who's a partner at the boutique business law firm, our firm, Hiller PC in Manhattan, in New York. Calling herself a recovering litigator, Lauren practiced commercial litigation for 10 years before co-founding the cannabis law practice at Hiller PC in 2014. Her clients include cannabis startups and investors, plant touching and non-plant touching companies. She has successfully prepared state licensing applications for all licensing types and a variety of company types, including vertically integrated companies. She also does pro bono work, including for the Ethical Data Alliance, which provides the public with genetic information about cannabis. And she's also a member of the pro bono team in the William Washington versus Barr lawsuit. She is a board member and treasurer of the International Cannabis Bar Association, and she regularly writes articles for the Marijuana Venture magazine. In 2015, Lauren was named a rising star among top New York Metro attorneys as featured by Super Lawyers, and in 2019, Lauren was named a super lawyer among the Metro Super Lawyers list. So now that I've gone through that very extensive background and each one of your amazing careers, I would like to turn the floor to each of you just to give maybe a 1 minute, 1 minute and a half synopsis of how exactly you guys got involved in the space. Because I think it's so incredibly important, not just that we're talking about issues like social equity and criminal justice reform, but also to sort of understand why any of us do the work that we do and what really motivates us to be passionate about this work. So we're going to start with Shaleen Title.
Thanks, Fatima, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I am a big fan of everyone that is speaking today and honored to be joining you. I don't have a great story about how I got involved. I just found out what was going on back in college and was horrified and decided to do something about it. But what I can share is that having a lot of different perspectives, starting out as an activist and campaign staffer for legalization generally, and then getting experience as a lawyer for small businesses and seeing how difficult it was. I then became an activist specifically for this intersection of social equity and cannabis, and then had my own business. I had a non-plant touching business focused on recruiting and diversity and inclusion. And what I learned through all of those different perspectives and now being a government official is that no matter what your particular position or perspective is, if you are interested in social equity and cannabis, you have to think of yourself as an activist and you have to learn activist tactics. Because if you just act like a regular business owner or government official and you're not using everything in your power, then you won't be able to succeed. But if you do, and we're all united, then I think we have a very good chance.
Excellent. Jason?
Hey everyone, my name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and I first got into the cannabis justice movement, I'll say, when I was arrested for simple possession in high school at the age of 16. And so I was in suburban Connecticut. I was on the way to school and was smoking with my friends, and they called security. And as soon as we stepped on campus, cop cars surrounded us. The security guards in their little golf carts were really mean to us. And I just had no idea why everyone was so upset with something so simple, it seemed at the time. And then I got to go through the bureaucratic process and actually learn about our student code of conduct and how certain offenses are treated disproportionately than others. I was also able to then go through the criminal justice system and see who were the folks that were receiving the sentences and who were the folks that were giving out the sentences. And there's a really clear racial division there between the two. So from that, I learned that it wasn't just that Jason Ortiz made a mistake, is that there's this entire system out there that is imprisoning my community in order for white folks to make a lot of money. And so from there, I was basically an activist ever since. I was suspended from school for 45 school days for simple possession. So I had a lot of time on my hands, and I was lucky enough that the internet was around and I started to research things. And that's when I found out about the school to prison pipeline. And so once I learned about that term, it really made it where I wanted to spend my time making sure that those that came after me didn't have to suffer the same situation. And so lucky enough, I was able to go to college after that because of the work of a group called Students for Sensible Drug Policy. That's been a big part of my activism. That's right. That's how I met Shaleen and then came in touch with so many fantastic people. But they changed a law called the Higher Education Act's Federal Aid Elimination Penalty. And that law basically said that if you got caught while you were in high school or in college, you couldn't access financial aid. But because of the work of activists, they changed it where it was only you didn't qualify if you got caught while on financial aid. So it's a very small, very incremental change that meant Jason Ortiz could go to college, right? And so I was able to go to college. I was able to join SSDP. I was able to meet fantastic activists and learn about social justice, right? And so I came at the industry from a social justice perspective. But once legalization started to win and started to pass, I noticed the laws did not line up with how I would have put them forward or how we were talking about them. And so I began to look a little bit more closely at the business side and the licensing side of things. And I was lucky enough to know Shaleen, and Shaleen was actually the one that recruited me to MCBA so that we could work on our first model state legalization bill. So it was the first bill that was drafted completely by people of color, not one diversity expert on a panel of 40 people, but all 40 people were people of color. 35 out of 40 were people of color, but it was, you know, we drove it. We got to reshape how we talked about policy, right? Instead of always having to argue against bad bills, we wanted to put forward a good bill and actually show people how it was done. And not only that, but the process of creating that bill and bringing stakeholders to the table, receiving impact first and then producing our policy after, really changed how I looked at what community organizing means in the terms of public policy. And so from there, I met so many amazing people. We were able to grow the organization. And it's over and abundantly clear that the difference between 2014 legalization bills and 2020 legalization bills, equity has become a huge part of anything moving forward. And so I'm really happy that that is the case, but we still have a lot more work to do for sure.
Great work. Hi, Joe, you ready?
I'm ready, yes. I am among giants, I've got to say, and thank you for having me, and thank you all for enduring me. But I want to assure you that there is continuity in this movement. I have been studying cannabis on more or less daily basis for about 40 years now. I'm in my early 50s. And so from the time of my youth, much like Jason, I have had an interest in cannabis. And along the way, growing up in New York City as a publicly educated person, I came to have friends from all walks of life who were involved in things like cannabis and all kinds of things that were, you know, kind of rites of passage almost. I've learned as a dad to teenagers, you know, and a lot of these things were bad behaviors. But I grew up seeing that the way that laws were enforced against me was perhaps a little bit different than against other people. And I coupled this with, you know, because we all pursue our passions. You want to do well in life, you pursue your passions, right? I learned at an early age, and those of you who know me can appreciate this, that I like to argue. And I like to argue on behalf of the underdog. I like to beat up bullies, you know, I like to argue and to win for people that might not have a voice. And so as I went through college in New York, I went to Columbia undergrad, and I was a psychology major. I thought I'd want to be a therapist and help people with their problems and listen to them. But the truth be told, I really didn't feel like going to school that long. And so I took the LSATs and I went to this remarkable, amazing law school in Brooklyn that Fatima knows very well, Brooklyn Law School. And I fell completely in love with the law. And as a New York City kid, my backdrop was really, as we can all appreciate, like crime, criminality, urban living, you know, all kinds of interesting issues that have really come to the fore in the past year. And so I developed an interest in criminal law, and I pursued it. In the early days of my life as a law student, I worked at the Fed Defenders, which is like federal legal aid in the Eastern District of New York. I worked at a law firm that did a lot of like large-scale drug trafficking with principally foreign nationals. And along the way, I started to see a way to utilize federal guidelines, which were almost mandatory then, to get sentences that were below those guidelines because of clients' unique circumstances in their lives. And so I spent a lot of time trying to get sentences below the crack guidelines because of the anomaly between crack and powder cocaine and the racial disparities that those laws really represented. I'm happy to report that those disparities were really obliterated and the laws were changed. But I come to marijuana law now as somebody who defended and has defended multi-ton operators and small-time users and people all throughout the United States in pot cases, simply because I thought it was the right thing to do. A lot of those were big matters, but a lot of those were pro bono matters involving small people. And you call my office today, I'm on that normal hotline. I'll give you advice and talk to you about your ticket or whatever it is, because I think that it's the right thing to do. But I think that marijuana today, it's remarkable to see a beautiful industry of young people cropping up and talking about like some really amazing and important things. Money is important and investing is important, but I think that for me, cannabis and cannabis legalization is an opportunity for us to retrench things pertaining to social justice and social justice reform in enormous ways, whether it's over policing and criminalization or the over punishment of some of these offenses, or the view of drugs as a stigmatic behavior as opposed to perhaps a public health problem or even more a choice. So that's kind of like the more or less the context of how I got here.
Great. Now we turn to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. And like Joe, I am just, humbled by the influential and inspiring participants we have on this panel. So thank you so much for letting me participate in this. I came to the cannabis industry through my mom's end of life care. So, first and foremost through patient advocacy. She was a cancer patient in California back in 2009, sort of pre-Cole memorandum, back at a time when we didn't have really any, medical cannabis regulations. It was not a very safe time to be engaged in the cannabis industry. And I learned very quickly that those businesses that seek to help patients have a lot of legal problems, whether it be problems with neighbors, land use and zoning, problems with the cops, problems with gangs. And it was very clear that there was legal work to do, but I lived in New York. I was just sort of temporarily in California for my mother's treatment. So I just sort of sat on it from a patient advocacy perspective and moved back to New York. Unfortunately, I work for a law firm at Hiller where we use the law as an instrument for social change. So I sort of had a predisposition, to fall into these constitutional issues regarding equal protection and social justice. And it doesn't take very long working in the cannabis industry. I started representing investors that were my first clients, and then I started representing the other side of the money, which are applicants and startups. And it doesn't take very long in the cannabis industry before you realize that gross inequities replete throughout the licensing process and in the criminalization of cannabis and how the Controlled Substances Act is enforced against people of color. And again, sort of tending to that predisposition, my mother was one of the founders of an affirmative action program, or the very first affirmative action program here in New York City. And I myself studied a lot of constitutional law. And so I really just fell into these issues quite naturally. And as Shaleen mentioned, when you're in the business of cannabis, you're not just in the business of cannabis, you're in the business of regulatory compliance and you're in the business of advocacy. You just can't be in this industry without, pushing for change because there's so much change that needs to happen. So I started representing some of these clients in the more restrictive and competitive medical cannabis markets, particularly in Pennsylvania, which was one of the first states to adopt a diversity and community impact program. Everything just sort of took off from there. Once you get deep in developing diversity plans and community impact plans, the inequities reveal themselves and then you push to resolve them. So that's what inspires me and motivates me to continue the work that I do. I do what I can to take on, if New York is going to make, is going to give priority to social equity applicants, our practice is going to give priority to social equity applicants. So this is what I feel like I was born to do. It's one of the most impactful things that I could think of. Living in New York City, the birthplace of the Rockefeller laws, we have a tremendous responsibility to people who have been, penalized and suffer all of the collateral consequences associated with criminalization. So I see this as a responsibility, as an opportunity. I'm inspired by my clients. I'm inspired by all of you and the work that you do. And that's what brought me here and keeps me here.
Great. So when Hiller PC decided to do this webinar, there was no way that we could have imagined just how strongly the Black Lives Matter movement was going to take shape. This was well before the unfortunate and disgusting murder of George Floyd. This was before any of the protests took place. And so we couldn't have picked a more appropriate time to be having this conversation, because and I don't know exactly the backgrounds of the people who are tuning in today, but many Americans don't even realize the direct link between the war on drugs and police militarization and police brutality that has since ensued. And so I actually only found this out myself, but the Reagan administration, in going forward with a war on drugs, is actually when we started to really see the mass distribution of weapons to our local law enforcement officers. The 1033 program, which was subsequently created, is a program that provides additional extra weapons that are not being used by our military, and it's all being distributed to smaller local law enforcement agencies that can't afford to invest in these kinds of military weapons. And if you look at a lot of the law enforcement presence, especially in the protests that have been going on, most of the officers are starting to look more and more like soldiers than they are like officers. But this all began with the war on drugs. Reagan saw this as a war. So what do you do when you're at war? You bring in the military, right? So there really is a direct link between the war on drugs and what we're now seeing, in terms of police brutality, in terms of, disproportionate impact on communities of color. It's much more centrally connected than people would otherwise think. And the war on drugs, unfortunately, at the center of it is cannabis prohibition. It's sort of the low-hanging fruit. It was a very easy tool of oppression that was used starting from the Nixon administration all the way until the present. It's sort of scary, but as legalization has progressed throughout the country, we've actually continued to see huge disproportionate arrests and prosecutions of persons of color in states where there is adult use or medical cannabis programs. So we really are so happy to have this conversation, to have you guys join in and watch us, because this is such a pressing time to be discussing these issues. And so with that, I do want to start with talking about the obvious background context here, which is New York legalizing. So we've been hearing talk about New York legalizing for years now, and there's always some kind of obstacle that sort of, ruins any chances of success. But that being said, Governor Cuomo has continued to press on, at least in the public, about his commitment to this issue. And he's been doing it even in the mid of this COVID pandemic crisis. And so we're hearing from several different people that we're looking at cannabis legalization in New York either by the end of this year or early next year, probably at the latest. And so we think it's incredibly important that we discuss social equity and criminal justice reform, because as most advocates, as anyone on this panel can tell you, you can't have true legalization without social equity and criminal justice reform. They are completely interconnected. You can't have one without the other. It just does not work. So I want to start off with Lauren as the person most connected or intimate, I would say, with what's going on in New York right now in terms of legalization, just so that you can sort of get us up to speed so everyone's on the same boat about what exactly is being proposed right now. I know there's a few different proposals that have been thrown around, but what's currently still on the table, and specifically with respect to social equity provisions as well as criminal justice reform.
Sure. So great question. A lot of ambiguity with respect to what's happening in New York. There are two measures. One is called the Cannabis Regulation and Taxation Act, and it's found in the budgetary measure that Cuomo has adopted. And then we also have a standalone measure called the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. And that is a piece of legislation. Today is the last day, I think, of the legislative session or the budget. So things could happen today, maybe even by the end of this call. Maybe one of them will pass, but they overlap and they compete in some respects. And I think anyone who has analyzed these two measures can say overwhelmingly that the MRTA, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, takes into account social justice issues more readily and in a better way than the Cannabis Regulation and Taxation Act, and mostly because the CRTA has a lot of discretion built into it, whereas the MRTA makes the reinvestment into community reinvestment programs mandatory. So we have these competing regulations. Both of them do provide a priority licensing to social equity applicants, women-owned, minority-owned, people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, which, like in Massachusetts, are people who have been directly impacted. Either they themselves have been arrested, or an immediate family member has been arrested, or they live in an area that's been over-policed. Living below the welfare line, suffering, from the collateral consequences of they or a direct family member being targeted for war on drugs. So priority is given to those types of applicants and measures. But the MRTA really builds out, how tax revenue would be spent to support those communities, whereas the CRTA leaves a lot of room for discretion. And so, if we look a little bit about, some of the issues in the MRTA that are more favorable for, social justice reform generally, it's a little bit more small business friendly. It has multiple points of entry, and both of them do, but the MRTA more so. But the MRTA, like I said, calls for a specific % of tax revenue to be allocated to this community reinvestment grants program. And they assure a very diverse board to be in charge of, how these funds are spent. It includes members from a variety of interdisciplinary departments in New York, including Children and Family Services, Health, the Labor Department, Education, the Senate, the Assembly, the Comptroller, and the Attorney General. The grants are going to cover job placement and skills, adult education, mental health, substance use disorder, housing, financial literacy, expungement, resentencing of marijuana-related offenses, and other similar programs. Now, the CRTA does call for reinvestment, but again, no specific money is allocated. Also very interesting, the MRTA calls for a goal of 50% of licenses being awarded to community or to social equity and economic empowerment applicants. Whereas the CRTA identifies priority, but it doesn't exactly say how they intend to get there. And neither does the MRTA, but a little bit more optimistic because those goals are stated within the legislation itself. So it gives, the committee, something to look forward to. Both the MRTA and the CRTA call for a new Office of Cannabis Management, and Governor Cuomo is going to get to appoint all of the folks associated with that office. But under the MRTA, the legislature will get to provide a check on that and vote and make sure that everything is equitable. Whereas under the CRTA, Cuomo has, sort of carte blanche over who he can appoint to that committee. And unfortunately, Cuomo doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to cannabis in New York. I am optimistic that, in view of the pressure with social justice reform and police brutality, that he's going to take it more seriously. And there's no question that New York needs a lot of money, but we want to make sure that that money is spent in the right place. So very exciting things happening in New York, especially on the social equity front. We have a lot to learn from other states, a lot to learn from Massachusetts, a lot to learn from Illinois, a lot to learn from Pennsylvania and California. And then we have the opportunity to see where some of these programs may have gone wrong. And I don't know if that's something you want to talk about a little bit later, but hopefully New York will learn from the successes and failures of prior states that have tried to, implement these community impact and diversity programs. And we've got, it's the 5th most populous state in the country. So we really do have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility to get this right here in New York. So fingers crossed, today's the day, maybe, maybe this year, maybe a special session in November. But I'd like to say end of the year, beginning of next year, this is going to happen in New York.
Well, that's good news to hear. So Jason, I have a question for you because the MCBA had put together a cannabis social equity tri-state summit back in December of 2019. And the goal of that entire summit was to really inform the lawmakers in the tri-state area who at the time were all considering legalization in coordination with one another. The goal of that summit really was to have as many advocates, activists, individuals who own companies, everyone who's actively in the space, particularly persons of color in the space, to have them all come together and talk about what it is that they really want to see in any of these bills. What's the ideal legislation? What does that look like? And I was actually honored to have been asked to speak, and that's how you and I met. And I thought it was a really great event. But I'd like you to talk just a little bit about what went into you putting together that summit and what exactly you were looking for MCBA to come out of it. What were the solutions, the goals that you were really looking to see come out of that event?
So I think primarily with those events, our goal is movement unity and consensus on what we want, right? And so whenever we're trying to build a movement, there's always disagreement of what we're even trying to accomplish. And so when it comes to something like cannabis policy, there's so many different details that it is always going to be that we agree on some things and not on others. And so for us, it's really seeing the details of what excites people, what offends people, and where there's a lot of overlapping consensus that we can build on. Same thing with our model state policy. And so from that, I wanted to hear from New Jersey and New York, and I'm in Connecticut, I'm in Hartford, Connecticut, and so we're part of the tri-state. And, bringing all those different groups together and, meeting face to face, I'm glad we did it because we may not be able to do something like that again, but it was super helpful to build that movement unity so that we're talking to friends and allies, not, just folks that we've seen that have titles. And so for me, it was very much figuring out what are our no points, like what is the point where we say we will accept legalization if it has X, Y, and Z in it. If it doesn't, then it's a no. Right. And so I think there's a huge difference in the MRTA and the CRTA, and you can see the difference based, in the details of who wrote it, right? And so the MRTA was written by Black and brown people, and they very specifically said we need to have accountability and specific metrics of where this money is going to go. We cannot leave it up to discretion. And that was definitely an overwhelming agreement with the group that like leaving anything up for debate or discretion means we get zero. And so now I look at any of those policies that, you know, folks in the industry might want to say you want to keep it narrow, right? But when they say narrow, they mean not including Black and brown people. And so it's a matter of really being hardlined around what we will and will not accept, and being willing to shut the whole thing down if they don't include our communities. And so that is the biggest disagreement, I think, between those two bills, is how much money is going to go into the communities most impacted by the war on drugs, right? And so that comes from both community investment, which we look at as when the government uses revenue to reinvest back in those communities. But there's also the economic side as far as economic empowerment for business owners and small businesses. That is another way to ensure that resources make it to those communities, and making sure that we have a piece of the pie and it doesn't go to all the other big MSOs. And that is what we're seeing in most states. It does go to most of the MSOs. So we don't have the luxury of reasonable, you know, like giving them the benefit of the doubt, because the benefit of the doubt should be going the other direction. They have to prove that they're going to be able to follow through on the promises that we're making. And so that was abundantly clear. The other difficulty that came out of the group is that we are talking about 3 different legislatures with 3 different relative powers of their Black and Latino caucuses. And so the important role that Black and Latino caucuses play on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable is going to be a huge determinant of whether or not we'll be able to accomplish what we want. In New York, I would say it has the strongest Black and Latinx and Asian caucuses. And so I believe that even as a person in Connecticut, New York is the battleground, because New York is going to inform what Connecticut does. We don't have a strong leadership. We have some leaders, but they're not in the same sort of bargaining place that a lot of the folks are in New York, right? And it's also the communities of color in Manhattan and in other, you know, in the boroughs are incredibly strong, right, compared to somewhere like Connecticut. And so we do have to unite and leverage a national network on a local fight in order to get what we want. And so I think that's a big piece of community organizing, is figuring out what power you do have and how to leverage it appropriately. I do think, like, I come from a political organizing background. Like, that's really how I got my start in organizing things like education funding and things like that. So when I came to the space, I noticed the way I approached some of these problems was very different. And so I do think part of also bringing those people together is making sure that the activists and the community organizers that know how to cause trouble are able to meet the business owners and the folks that can take advantage of if and when we win, right? And so without both of those groups organizing together, we're always going to end up where we maybe won a battle but lost the war. And so I think we're at the space now where we're able to really have grand strategy and grand discussions about a national leverage on what it is that we want, where we can say, in New York, if you don't do community organizing right, it's not going to happen. Same thing's going to happen in Florida, same thing's going to happen in Connecticut, same thing's going to happen everywhere. And luckily, New York already did do that. And so it is putting all the other legislators on notice that if you don't do this part right, it simply won't happen. The tension there, though, is that the status quo isn't going to help us either, right? And so we want to make sure we do it right. But here in Connecticut, no matter how much money I have, I can't get a license, right? And so that's not helping anybody. But for me, it is more important that we get it right from the jump. And if it takes longer, then so be it, than having to go back and fix things later, because it just doesn't work out in our favor whenever we defer our justice till the future, right? We saw what happened in Illinois in a weird way, that because of how COVID sort of interacted with everything, all the medical folks were able to bring sales online quickly, but all of the rec equity programs had to wait. Right. And so now we saw months and months and months where all of the equity programs had to wait as other people are making hundreds of millions of dollars. The other piece is that the industry, while I want to make sure activists and business owners work together, the industry is not always our friend on this, right? There are certain members of the industry that are currently profiting off the status quo, and they don't want to see legalization happen. And so there's no way that we can have a conversation about what is going to be possible or how do we leverage things without identifying that the industry is going to fight us every step of the way. We need to be able to differentiate from the folks that are supporting the right laws and those that are actively opposing them, which is, again, a situation we saw in Illinois with GTI leveraging thousands and thousands of dollars in order to slow down the equity program implementation. So it's going to be a big battle of really identifying who is actually supportive of what we're doing and who is just talking about it, but then stabbing us in the back behind the scenes.
Absolutely. So that actually brings me to Shaleen, because Shaleen is one of the commissioners on the CCC, I should say, in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is one of the leaders when it comes to social equity in the cannabis space. They're one of the first states that ever even implemented or attempted to implement a comprehensive program that was dedicated to supporting and uplifting persons of color who, typically have barriers to entry in any industry, but particularly in cannabis, where, we're talking about a really volatile, high risk, very expensive industry to enter. So I want Shaleen to sort of talk to us a little bit about what it is that went in the process of Massachusetts coming up with this program, and sort of some of the things looking back at your process, what you think maybe should have been done better, what you think has been done really well and that New York should emulate. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Fatima. Let me start by just hard endorsing everything that Jason just said about building a coalition, because it is so important that in order to use your power as the people and working people and people who have like popular opinions about cannabis, that you are united in what you will stand for, because the current will push you very hard in a different direction, not just because of intentional racism and intentional push for profit, but also just because of systemic and unconscious issues that we aren't necessarily looking at or paying attention to that affect everything. So I absolutely admire the way that we have seen in your region that people are willing to walk away from the table if the minimum standards are not met. And I absolutely encourage that, because in my mind, I'm working on policies that are going to be set for 100 years or more potentially, right? Like if you need to wait a little bit to get it right, I think that's right. Now, I won't go through everything that Massachusetts did, because diversity plans, positive impact plans, like the idea of social equity, it was all very groundbreaking when we did it 5 years ago. It is not groundbreaking anymore. I think it's just kind of the minimum at this point. But I do want to focus on a couple things that I think have not been talked about. And also let me say how important it is to really pay attention to legislative mandates versus regulatory authority versus municipal authority. I think those are not things that I paid a ton of attention to when I was involved in the drafting process. My mind was sort of, if it's in the law, it's in the law. But what I have seen is, especially when you're dealing with three very different buckets, let's say, that have all been addressed. There's what you typically have discussed when you talk about a social equity program, which is business licensing and licensing caps. Then you have the reinvestment of tax revenue into communities, which is going to be handled by a completely different agency and a completely different bureaucratic process, and definitely needs to have teeth to make sure that money goes where it's intended. And then you have criminal justice reform, which is a completely different area, which is making sure that we are taking measures to stop the disparities that we've seen post-legalization in every other state, which I do see getting better now that we're paying more attention to it, but we absolutely need to focus on that. And it's a lot bigger than expungement. Sometimes you see people say expungement and they think they've dealt with criminal justice reform, but that's not absolutely true. That needs a lot of attention. So with all of those different agencies and efforts, you need to make sure that there is a legislative mandate that is strong, has teeth, has enough specifics that it's going to be followed, and has enough accountability to make sure that the relevant agency is collecting the data, making sure they're doing it, presenting it back to the legislature and public, and then taking action if the data isn't sufficient. And the only reason that we continue to be progressing in Massachusetts is because we have all of those things in our accountability measures. So we weren't able to just try it and say, oh, well, priority licensing didn't work, we'll move on to the next thing. We have to keep getting more, escalating our tactics as time goes on. So you want to have that in all the different areas, and you want to have sufficient flexibility for the regulatory authorities as well, because we can't predict what is going to go wrong and what decisions they'll need to make. And I think the way that they exercise that flexibility has to be done in public. That's something the commission has had to do since the beginning. So I mentioned I want to flag a couple of things that don't get talked about enough. One is license caps. So I think that kind of went under the radar in the Massachusetts law, because we were talking a lot about equity and all the things that we were going to do, for people from these communities under the law. But what we also had was a limit on how many businesses one person or entity can own or control. And so what that means is, while we're trying to figure out how to provide economic justice to these communities, which no one has figured out yet, no one can come in and dominate or exploit the industry. So that is extremely important. And I think maybe was not taken seriously by some of the companies in the beginning. But as we have set those limits and set very strict consequences, if you, for example, make a change in ownership without approval in Massachusetts, your licenses will be void. So those are caps that we take extremely seriously, and I don't think that you can have a successful business-focused equity program without those types of license caps. The other thing that I think is a little more innovative is our exclusivity period. So we currently are in a period where, for delivery-only licenses, for the first 2 years, they will only be available to social equity and economic empowerment applicants. And we take ownership very seriously. So they have to be majority owned by the owners who meet the criteria for those programs. So unlike in other states where you might qualify for an equity program just based on who you hire, here it has to be ownership only. And it is only for those businesses for the first 2 years, but we did set out a very specific set of criteria by which we will decide whether to extend that period at the end of 2 years. So if we're not meeting our goals in terms of the financial feasibility of those businesses, if there's not enough people of color and women in the industry, and if they're not just generally successful in the ways that we intended, we'll extend that period. So I think that's a good way to respond to a lot of the barriers that we've seen even with our equity program. So I'd recommend thinking about exclusivity periods as well. One key thing is a lot of cities and states are talking about ratios, 1-to-1 ratios, general applicants and equity applicants. I would suggest making that more specific, because, for example, I just testified this to the city of Boston recently. They have an equity program with the 1-to-1 ratio, but if you are counting one of these delivery licenses that's very small, that's basically a courier service, as the same as, say, a big retail dispensary downtown or a huge cultivation facility, that kind of undermines the point of 1-to-1 ratios. So I would consider being more specific about that. And then lastly, I just want to tell you to address the part of your question about what we would have done differently. The biggest, most important hurdle in being equitable in Massachusetts has been the municipalities. So our state had a mandate to be equitable in the way that we license, but every business has to get some form of local approval, and cities and towns do not have a mandate to be equitable. And so that has resulted in a consistency where most small businesses or businesses in our programs have run into difficulty at the local level. So you definitely have to make sure that whatever mandates you put on at the state level, you're also thinking about municipal as well.
So actually, to follow up on the last issue that you just raised about the municipalities, I know that there was an issue regarding corruption involving hosting agreements. I believe it was former Mayor Correa in Fall River. And I've heard complaints from applicants in the state of Massachusetts about these hosting agreements generally, even before that scandal broke out. But what do lawmakers in New York, from your perspective, do to try to prevent as much of that as possible? Obviously there's home rule, provisions that we have to be aware of, and in certain states, there is no way to really control each of the municipalities. But is there any kind of broad-based, provision that you think would be helpful in sort of mitigating some of this corruption that is happening on the local level?
Yeah, so two universal things. One is you do want to have a balance between making sure every municipality is participating in the goal while respecting that every city and town is different and they have their own community and their own way they want to implement it. So I think similar to what our mandate at the state level is, just mandate that they include equity in their decision making and that they are public, that they document how they did, and that if they're not successful, tax revenue shouldn't flow to them. That's what I think. Now, the second thing is making sure that there is a enforcing authority. That's what went wrong in Massachusetts, because there are actually very strict, clear limits on what municipalities can do, but our commission decided, not with my vote, not to enforce that. And so there's this loophole created where nobody is enforcing these limits until we saw federal prosecutors get involved with the corruption case that you mentioned. So you have to be clear not only what the limits are, but also who's going to enforce them.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to my next question, because I think it's really important to determine who exactly is, controlling the licensing framework, who's enforcing it on the local level, but also on, the statewide level, similar to the CCC. If New York creates an agency similar to the CCC, I think it matters who they appoint there and who is doing the appointing, who is approving of the appointment. And then, as you mentioned, on the local level as well, who's enforcing it on the local level. So I think that's so important. And you actually said in a recent interview that generally people from your background are not appointed to those types of positions. And I'd like you, and then I'm going to open the floor to everybody else to sort of give their idea of, the qualifications we should be looking for these individuals. But I would like you to just elaborate on what you meant by that and what you think, is important about your background in particular, but also any other advocates' background that we should be thinking about in terms of who should be appointed to these roles.
Well, for me, it was just really unusual to go straight from being an activist to the highest level of regulator, because typically you would have to go through a long career, and you would not be as willing to engage in these kind of activist tactics that we've been discussing. And it really let me see how much government agencies need activist energy, because the culture is completely different. You always just want to give people a heads up and not do anything bold and just worry about, not ruffling feathers. And so I think if you're trying to make a difference, you should actually think really hard about joining one of these regulating agencies, because we need more people like that in government, and not just as elected officials, but in these regulatory roles as well.
I think that's absolutely spot on. So I'm going to start with Joe, since poor Joe has not spoken yet, on these issues. And I definitely want to get your, especially because you've been, representing cannabis defendants for 25 years, right? You've been doing this criminal defense work for so long, and I'd really like your unique perspective on just how the criminal justice system works generally, but also, it also extends to social equity as well. What qualifications do you think should be either required or at least very strongly encouraged as we're looking for people to oversee the enforcement of any kind of licensing framework and any kind of criminal justice reforms that are implemented in New York?
Well, I think a certain degree of background is important, right? And whether it's an activist background or an advocate background or a legal background, right? Or maybe even an industry background, I think that's critically important. I think somebody who's shown a devotion and a dedication to social equity issues in the past is important. I think somebody who understands and places a premium on finding diversity and on building that kind of a marketplace of ideas would be the type of people that you'd want to have in those positions. And just speaking to the broader question, and I'm sitting and I'm listening to everyone talk about marijuana and marijuana licensing and social equity, and I see that there's the Ehrlichman quote that got popped up on the chat over there by Jason. Jason, we were talking about this just the other day. That like has, you know, pot laid off on the hippies and heroin laid off on the blacks, right? The pot's not really laid off on the communities of color. But I think that for me, the biggest picture is, and we talk about weaponizing the police, right? This, like the Controlled Substances Act started out with no mandatory minimum sentences. You know, there were no mandatory minimum 5, 10, 20 and life sentences that can put someone away and destroy their family and community. Those were grafted onto the statute in later years by people like Joe Biden endorsing the crime bill, right? And the Mandatory Minimum Sentencing Reform Act. But to me, watching the cocaine wars start in the 80s with like the Medellin cartel and these gigantic shipments of cocaine and these wars in South America over drugs, that's really when you begin to see the shift from hippies, right, and low-level heroin kind of dealing into this larger kind of trafficking that has the militarization of the police as a response. And that dovetails with civil forfeiture being utilized as an implement, really, again, against communities of color, right, to steal assets and make it very difficult to retain those assets and to take a very broad view of what might be a forfeitable property or a boat or a bank account, you know, taking, again, resources more frequently than not from the communities that really need them. But once you send the police in their armored gear into the communities that you decide to police, now you see the Controlled Substances Act being utilized, weaponized against communities of color. And what that really means is people come in and, yes, stop and frisk you, but also like scoop you up and arrest you and put you through a process and felonize you perhaps unnecessarily, and then have you face a draconian sentencing minimum that takes you away from your parents or your spouse or your children or your job or your school and destroys completely your path in life. And so I think that for me, what we need to do is not shepherd people into careers in cannabis as much as try to shepherd them into careers involving like science and math and business and education, and be in a position to kind of, it's like a forest fire, you know, the over-policing of our communities ravaged them completely and burned them down, and we need to build those communities up. And I've spoken to so many people. I say, why'd you become a heroin trafficker? Why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? I remember the first guy that I ever had to tell, I lost your appeal and you're going to do a life without parole sentence behind bars, who was in a wheelchair, by the way, told me that he got into heroin when he was a little kid in New York City because of a lack of opportunity. And for him, the role model was like the superintendent that as he got older, he learned wasn't even the real super. And so we can talk about equalizing the slate, and cannabis is a nascent field, and it's awesome to have an industry where we can try to do that. But we now need to apply that to other fields. I like to see all the cannabis activists out there go like talk and advocate against mandatory minimums, right? And advocate against overcriminalization, and advocate about other drugs being public health issues instead of things that you have to go and be in prison for a long time over. Because to me, the genesis of the problem that we have now with a lack of diversity and a lack of equity and a lack of inclusion goes way, 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 way back. And you can point obviously to well before the Controlled Substances Act. That's just been the proxy to do this to people for the past almost 50 years, you know? But I mean, I think we should all be on a personal mission, and we should take heart at the progress that we've made in cannabis and continue to push that movement until you can go buy pot at the supermarket, like a Tetley's weed bag. You know, that's for me legalization. I need a bunch of licenses. I need to go buy like the weed at the supermarket, right? But we should push along that continuum. And as we go, we should understand that we are a movement. This cannabis legalization movement is awesome and extraordinary and filled with beautiful people, like amazing and talented, beautiful people. And we got together over an issue, right? And we're gonna make it come out beautifully, but we need to apply that to other things that are really kind of the conditions that have been caused by the over-policing of our communities of color by the drug war.
So Joe, I'm going to come back to you in a second about criminal justice reform in particular and how it's playing out in New York also. But before I do that, do Lauren or Jason have anything else to add about qualifications for any of the individuals who'd be appointed to a commission or some kind of agency that's overseeing what is happening in terms of legalization and criminal justice reform in New York?
So, I saw it happen in Massachusetts. So I will say, like, I would like them to actually support legalization. And so I think what can happen sometimes is folks are put on these committees and they don't even like agree that the thing should be happening. And so I think that's really important. But, the connection to the community is going to be the most important piece. And if anyone doesn't understand or know how to have community forums and engage with folks on what it is that they want, it's going to be a real difficult time for them to answer the thousands of different ways that the war on drugs and over policing has affected our communities. And it's going to come as quite a surprise how comprehensive the policies they're going to have to implement really will be in order to make the constituents and stakeholders feel like you did a good job, right? And so it can be a really steep learning curve. So to Joe's point, really having some significant background and understanding of what exactly is happening, what's happening in the rest of the country is going to be really important. And so I know there's always got to be diversity of opinion and different communities will need different things. But if we have an entity that is, 7 people and 4 of those people voted against legalization, right, you're going to have a difficult time coming up with a comprehensive program. Now, it gets even trickier when we have states that are run by Republicans, right? If the legislature or the governor are folks that personally opposed it, that's going to be a really difficult situation, right? So I think there has to be some way I mean, we don't really ever know what people support and what they didn't, but I've seen what happens when committees or commissions are essentially at war with each other, and it becomes a mess. And so I would like to see folks not just understand it, but like actually want it to be successful.
For sure. I think real quick, just to add to that, no question, this needs to be a passion-driven, exercise and education, rooted in education and activism. But just one thing that nobody else mentioned, not as important as having that sort of sensitivity to the history, but there is an economic component here. There's a lot of folks that need to be driven by economics, and so diverse entities have a better bottom line. And I think that some people need to hear that, and there needs to be a bridge between the folks that are business and economic minded and the folks that are advocacy driven. And I think that bridge is very important to bring everybody into the loop. And so it can't be too heavy, on the economics, and it can't be too business driven, but there needs to be some constituent of folks that can speak to those who only hear the economics. And I think that that's super important to change everyone's hearts and minds, not just the activists.
Yeah, and really quickly on that one, I do think it's important to not look at things like possession as legalization alone, because it is an economic war on us, right? And so it is a matter of money and who gets to make money and disrupting communities' ability to make money. And so I think sometimes within activist circles, we're afraid to have that conversation about like, we deserve money out of this. And so it is really important that the context of what the war on drugs is, it's not exclusively criminal justice, right? Like the amount of economic damage done to our communities by over policing is tremendous. And I think before we are able to really say, did we actually heal the damage done, we need entities like commissions, like state legislatures to actually do an accounting of the economic damage done by their over policing policies that they've passed, right? Like these governments knew what was happening. Every single time one of these bills were passed, there were Black and brown people saying this is going to disrupt our communities, and they did it anyway. And so there is real accountability that needs to happen there. But of course, if we were to actually calculate that number, it's a tremendous number. But until we calculate it, we're forever going to be thinking we solved a part of the problem while leaving the massive wound unchecked, right? And of course, incarceration is making money for certain folks also, and that's another reason why this war is happening, right? That's another element of the economic war in our communities. And so we have to have a comprehensive understanding of what's happening here, because it does play out into lower school funding, less healthcare access, and all these other pieces that Joe mentioned earlier. So I think if someone is going to be coming to a commission, they have to have a full understanding of just how comprehensive the problem really is.
Absolutely.
So chime in on something that wasn't mentioned.
Absolutely.
Our commission is independent. It's 5 members jointly appointed by the governor, treasurer, and attorney general. And that has kept us from being controlled by any one entity. And I can't endorse that enough.
I think that's an excellent point. Actually, Lauren, what is in the MRTA currently as it's being proposed in terms of who gets to appoint and oversee that appointment?
Well, currently, Cuomo is appointing, but under the MRTA, the legislature gets a check on that. And then there's going to be a lot of this rulemaking and regulatory, has yet to happen. But it does look like there's going to be a lot more flexibility, and there's a lot more, it's a matter of law, it's a matter of legislature that MRTA actually carves out some of the qualifications and backgrounds for those who are going to be responsible for implementing the law, whereas the CRTA leaves that in the discretion. So I think that, we'd be in a much better place to ensure diverse slate of candidates under the MRTA.
Absolutely. So I do want to talk a little bit about criminal justice reform. We're at the hour, but does anyone have any objections to going over a little bit? Okay, great. So Joe, given your criminal defense background and obviously your work in New York, so in New York in 2019, I believe, legislators passed a bill to decriminalize cannabis, but obviously it was for certain categories of cannabis possession up until I think it was 2 ounces. Everything has been decriminalized up until 2 ounces, and there's also an automatic expungement component to that bill. Can you just talk to us a little bit about the specifics of that bill, which was obviously a way for lawmakers to get something through when they knew that legalization wasn't going to happen in 2019? And can you talk to us about what the difference is between decriminalization versus legalization for anyone who is, still not clear about the distinction there? You're on mute, Joe.
I'm unmuted. Very good. Yeah, simply put, in New York, we had partial decriminalization in 1977. And the scope was essentially you could possess up to 25 ounces of cannabis, not in public view and not burning. After that, there was a wellspring of complaint during the course of the Mayor, honestly, Giuliani and then Bloomberg's stop and frisk policy. Because when you were stopped and frisked, if you had weed in your pocket and it got taken out, it's now in public view, and there was no exception in the statute for how the cannabis got to be in public view. And so now these people who had otherwise been law-abiding citizens were being singled out and targeted, and these marijuana prosecutions were oftentimes beginning to be the end in the form of unraveling, or at least a basis to hold people. But last year, the city, the state passed a change to the penal law, section 221, to make what they call 221.05 and 221.10 offenses all violations, meaning you can possess up to 2 ounces of marijuana. You can dangle it around in public and even smoke it, and you'll get, if it's under 28 grams, you'll get a $50 fine. If it's up to 2 ounces, you get a $200 fine. And those convictions or those violations, when the case is done, will be automatically expunged. Like an expunge is different than a sealing. It's like it's gone, it goes away. A sealing is like you're masking it. And in many certain but still significant circumstances, that sealing can be unmasked. I will say, though, that I think that many people in New York and probably throughout the country don't avail themselves of the scope of the sealing provisions. In New York, if you have 1 felony conviction and it's more than 10 years old, you can make a motion to seal your conviction. 2 misdemeanors, seal the conviction. Not enough people are really doing that. But now in New York, at least up to 2 ounces of marijuana is not a criminal offense. I'd note that a concentrate's a criminal offense. You sell any kind of a concentrate, sell your gram of shatter, it's a felony in New York, right? But the difference between decriminalization, where you say, oh, you'll pay a fine up to a certain point, and legalization, I think a good example would be in last year's iteration of the MRTA. I almost feel like I shouldn't cite it because maybe someone will fix it. But last year, the MRTA was written so that if you possessed like a universe of weed, at most you paid a $350 fine. That is like legalization to me, although the fine is, one could argue, still some stumbling block to true legalization, right? So you have expunging provisions in New York. And by the way, when that law changed, people who've been convicted of those crimes previously, the B misdemeanor, the cannabis violation of under 25 grams in public, had their convictions expunged automatically. They didn't have to do anything. It was an automatic expungement provision. And so that saved a lot of people from collateral consequences of their convictions, right? And some of those are well known and some are arcane. I mean, some are arcane, like you can't operate a forklift. You can't get a license to do that. You can't be an air traffic controller, right? You're not gonna get like federal loan money, and you can't be in certain federal housing depending on the nature of the conviction, right? We all understand these things. Yes, you can generally vote. People think you can't vote as much, but the consequences of these small grade marijuana convictions are particularly concentrated upon people who are trying to kind of get a job when they have not got the greatest of employment history, or who are trying to bring themselves up, you know. And I think that they impact upon those kinds of vulnerable people dramatically. And with change in law, I think the stat was maybe near 20,000 people in New York would automatically have those records expunged, and they'd be kind of restored to status quo.
So in terms of automatic expungement, it's sort of an interesting and I think an important provision to be included in pretty much any either decriminalization or legalization bill across the country. The only issue with automatic expungement, and this is something I recently learned, and any of you feel free to correct me, but I'm pretty sure that under federal law, because cannabis is still illegal under federal law, ICE has authority to deport people who are here under a legal visa if they have been convicted of a cannabis conviction. And you can get that conviction vacated through a motion before a judge, and that should, in most circumstances, protect you from deportation, even if you're here legally. However, I've read that automatic expungement, without having a judge have a say in the matter, does not necessarily protect you from deportation, even if you're here with a legal visa. Is that true, Joe, or anyone else want to chime in?
I think retroactively, like if you were one of the beneficiaries of retroactive expungement, like the law changed and you'd been convicted previously, I think that's true. I believe that if you're convicted today going forward, that is not true. I think that's the line of demarcation in New York. But yeah, ICE is a problem. I mean, look, you can technically be deported for these marijuana offenses that involve over 25 grams. The simple possession, simple use is maybe an exception, but it begs all kinds of other questions about your moral turpitude, really, you know? So yeah, ICE is a really vulnerable point for people with any kind of conviction, not just a cannabis conviction. I mean, you literally are either detained or removed for virtually nothing.
Yeah, so I want to move quickly before we do close this off, just to the issue that Shaleen mentioned earlier about capital. So a lot of minority-owned businesses struggle to raise capital, and particularly because the licensing process can be really long and cumbersome in most states, they usually either have to give up most of their own equity in order to raise that capital, or their operations just completely fail. And so, Lauren, you know, as an attorney who has, you know, for years now been in the process of preparing licensing applications, representing minority-owned and non-minority-owned companies in the space in all different states, you know, what's your take on what you're experiencing firsthand as someone who's representing these individuals, and also what you think might be a potential solution that more states like New York should think about in terms of social equity? And then I'm going to obviously let the rest of you chime in.
Well, I think it's no secret that some of the more restrictive medical cannabis programs, where they were only awarding a handful of licenses, like in New York, you know, they chose companies for their capitalization. They wanted to make sure that they could withstand operating at a loss for a long period of time, an undetermined amount of time, whether the program was a success or failure. You know, and then given, you know, the social economics of that, you know, we didn't have any minority-owned businesses in New York. And I think that, you know, that was a change that, you know, was needed. And so we started seeing diversity programs being implemented in some of the more restrictive medical states like Pennsylvania. You know, but as we started seeing adult use, that was where the real opportunity and where the various points of entry, you know, it became apparent. And, you know, Massachusetts was really the first to want to lower those barriers to entry, you know, to ensure a diverse pool of applicants. But it is an expensive process, you know, and one of the most difficult aspects of the process is being able to show operational readiness, you know, within a certain amount of time. And it requires companies to raise a lot of capital in order to show that they can be able to open for business within a certain amount of time and be able to meet their operational guidelines or their operational timeline that they've set for themselves. You know, and so it's very difficult for them to raise that initial capital, especially before they even have a license. It's just theoretical. They want to go for a license. And so it's very difficult for them to convince, you know, venture capitals where, you know, maybe only 1 or 2% of venture capital money goes to, you know, a diverse pool of, of businesses anyway, so to attract that investment capital pre-revenue, pre-product, pre-license is a tremendous challenge. And then we have priority, which is intended to fix that. I think it does a good job, but it only takes us half of the way there. Giving, diverse applicants priority doesn't help them run the business. It doesn't help them to have liquidity throughout the life of the business. And so what we started to see in California was this continuing reinvestment, of the tax revenue. Hopefully, there'd be sufficient tax revenue to support continuing reinvestment, ongoing grants, land, opportunities for, favorable terms on loans and land and equipment and that sort of thing, and business support, education opportunities, not just giving them money and saying go, not just giving them priority and saying go, but continuing to reinvest in that. And then, allowing them to raise capital and have a change of ownership, but subject to transfer restrictions, so if there is a change in ownership, then the new owners have to pay for that, because if new owners are coming along, and we're seeing this in the MRTA, and hopefully New York will build upon this, but if there's going to be a change in ownership, for a priority applicant that received its license first because of its composition, and then that composition changes because that business needs to survive and attract capital, then the new owners should pay for that, and then that money should then get reinvested to support new applicants. So I think, it's all about generating money, and I think that this is a huge challenge, and I really wish I could, I want to ask Shaleen and Jason, how that's going, how are these transfer restrictions going? Are companies able to maintain sufficient capitalization to withstand operations, in this market where the regulations are constantly changing and where competition is really uncertain? I think transfer of ownership and sort of capitalization, ongoing capitalization, is a huge challenge, and I'm curious to see how Massachusetts is dealing with it and how New York is going to deal with it. It's a problem.
Yeah, so if Shaleen, if you want to add to anything, and then we'll move around to everyone else.
Sure. I think one obvious issue is that every state that is trying to be equitable should have a loan fund like Illinois does. But in terms of the transfer of ownership, it is tricky, right? Because you don't want to tell an equity business you're never allowed to sell your business, right? You need to be at this counter, when you're 80 years old. You need to give them the same kind of freedom that other businesses have, while also making sure they can't immediately sell out, and especially if there's predatory companies in a time like now. So our general philosophy, and I can talk to people after if they want to know the specifics, is if you don't meet the requirements anymore in terms of who your owners are, you're not eligible for the benefits anymore. That's basically how we treat it.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I have a couple of points here. First, I'll just say that the barriers to entry thing is not by accident, and it is not because the legislators want the program to be effective. It's because big industry lobbies to make sure that the barriers are as high as possible. So those are political choices that the different commissions are making, right? So the difference between an application fee of $25,000 or $25 is a political decision made by that commission that is informed by the people that are lobbying them. So when it comes to barriers to entry, we can design that to be as positive or difficult as we want. Take Oregon, for instance. Oregon made the barrier to entry to get a cultivation license very little, right? And a lot of the folks that were in the legacy market did transition over. So when we're making these decisions about whether it's effective or not, it's another reason I pointed to earlier, they have to actually want it to be effective, and really fully understanding why some of the programs didn't work out as they wanted to. It's not necessarily because of the intent or the policies, but just that money is constantly being flooded into the system to slow it down. This is not cannabis specific, right? All industries, we see lots of people pouring money in to make it more difficult to get in. And so for me, I would like to see the priority inverted that we see currently now, that has high capitalization as the primary reason to do it, and that also grandfathers in those folks into the rec market. So for me, it should be the inverse. All of those folks have to wait until the equity system is up on its feet and strong and stable before they get to expand. I'd like to see those licensing wait until there's parity. So for instance, in Connecticut, it was one of these situations that's highly restricted. We have 4 growers since 2010. And so in the last 10 years, we've only had 4 growers. All 4 of them are MSOs, right? And so Curaleaf, for instance, is one of them, and they're everywhere. So it's a situation of no matter how I structure it, if they get to go first, they're going to, be able to crush me even 6 months after I open my doors. So for me, we need a total flipping of the priority structure when it comes to licensing. Let the small folks go first and get some of the kinks out of it. Let them get that initial first wave of profits and make sure that they're able to be stable, and then add additional licenses. And then the other piece is also like with the equity applicants, one thing that doesn't come up too often that we probably should be talking about more is mergers and acquisitions within the equity movement, right? Because as we have to compete with bigger and bigger entities, the right move is for us to unite and join forces as businesses, focus on where we're most effective. Maybe I'm a cultivator, maybe I'm a transportation person, right? But it is going to be better for me to unite with a few other equity applicants to compete with these bigger people. So incentivizing equity mergers and acquisitions is something that I don't think is talked about very often, but can and would at least allow for growth. It would allow for folks that maybe aren't as effective as others to exit, right? Which is part of business. But maybe that economic power remains within the equity ecosystem.
I think that's all excellent points, Jason. Joe, did you have anything to add to this?
I mean, a couple things. You know, I represented, and I still do, a lot of these smoke shops in Manhattan and the West Village. Many years ago, they get busted for selling bongs, you know, water filtering tobacco pipes. And now I'm representing a guy that I represented in a trademark dispute with the Rourke Company a couple of years ago. I'm representing him in another thing. But by and large, these are stores that are owned by first-generation immigrants. They work very, very hard. They're able to get a tobacco license. They're able to pay oftentimes prohibitive rent, and they work like their tails off to try to make it. But they couldn't do that if what they were selling was as regulated as you see with cannabis today. And I think a lot of the problems surrounding the high capital costs and startup costs are the result of over regulation. And I've said this before, I'd like to be able to go buy the Tetley weed bag. But for now, maybe the way that we overcome this is by emphasizing micro licensing so that we have people who can open up the small grow, the small dispensary, the small processing facility. They can make small batch, they can make artisanal or bespoke. But I think if you look at cannabis from an economic, a macroeconomic perspective, like say a shirt or bowls or glass, you'd find that many, many years ago, 600 years ago, we'd all be sitting here in craft outfits, right? Your buttons would be handmade, your bowl would be bespoke. Everything is made by an artisan. And then we get to the Industrial Revolution and people stand on an assembly line, they're making pins and people are putting a hole in the pin. And then everyone's eating white bread and having TV dinners and they love this uniformity until we get to things like the craft beer movement, right? And craft rises from the ashes of industry. And I think if you apply that kind of, you know, principle to cannabis, what you'd find is legacy farmers doing this amazing stuff. We all loved the legacy farmers. People coming and trying to get into this gigantic new industry, right? And industrializing it. They come from different backgrounds. They've got different skills. One of the skills that those people didn't have, they have an MBA, but they couldn't grow legacy cannabis, right? So they swoop on in, and now you've got these companies that are seeking tens and hundreds of millions of dollars from investors and then leveraging it, and they become highly marginalized and go kaput. What was MedMen selling for today? Like 23 cents or something a share? I ditched my MedMen at $7, you know, just by way of example. But what rises from some of these experiments, which have been really awesome and have pushed, as I said, this social justice movement, what rises, I believe, are the people, the craft movement. And I think that we're going to see this kind of resurgence in an interest in low batch, high quality, hopefully with lower operating costs and entry points that are available to everybody. Just like I think Seattle had a wonderful micro licensing scheme, yes?
Did you say something, Lauren?
That's it.
I just said, I hope you're right, Joe.
Oh, my hope springs eternal. We'll see.
So Shaleen mentioned a little while ago that she thinks, you know, something like a loan fund would probably help a lot of these companies struggling in order to access capital. And she mentioned Illinois as an example of a state that's done that. And obviously Massachusetts hasn't done that. But there are some municipalities in Massachusetts that have, right? Didn't Boston do that? And I believe Holyoke. So have you seen, has there been enough time to tell how those funds are working there, and if that's something, you know, in addition to Illinois, that New York can look to as models for how to actually create these loan funds and what to do or what not to do to learn from that?
Well, the Boston Loan Fund is too early to tell at this point. But I think Boston is a really great example of how you can use your local power. So there's one business operating in Boston right now called Pure Oasis. It's a minority-owned economic empowerment business. If they transfer their ownership, I believe their host community agreement will no longer be valid. And under our rules, they can deliver. They're one of only 3-4 retail businesses in the state that can deliver directly to consumers. So that shows how if you use the state and local power together and you have a business that is complying in a good investment, you can attract investment. And I think it's important for us to do that on top of making funds available.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So we do unfortunately have to wrap up in the next minute or so. But before we do, I did obviously want to point to the elephant in the room, which is that a lot of the issues that we've been talking about for this past hour and a half are all sort of under the shadow of federal prohibition. You know, so long as we continue to see cannabis as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act, a lot of the access to capital issues, funding, you know, criminalization, disproportionate arrests and prosecutions, all of that is going to continue because unfortunately, even in states that have legalized, it really does start from the top down. There's a lot of emulation that states take from how the federal government is approaching these issues, and they have been for decades. So, you know, our firm, Hiller PC, as I mentioned earlier, we are the legal team along with Joe Bondy, bringing our pro bono lawsuit against the DOJ and the DEA, and we are filing our petition with the U.S. Supreme Court tomorrow. We're hoping that it gets accepted and that it succeeds. And in that case, if we are successful, many of the issues we just discussed will be a little bit easier to actually put through, I'm hoping. And also Hiller PC, you know, is so committed to not just these issues, but particularly the issue of police brutality, which is obviously much more complicated than just cannabis. It's definitely, you know, far-reaching, although cannabis has played, unfortunately, a very central role in it. And so, you know, as we are committed to this process, we're committed to the Black Lives Matter movement, we are now going to be representing on a pro bono basis defendants in police brutality cases, 1983 actions. So we do hope that, you know, if anyone is looking for representation in these cases, please know that we are allies. We're here to help. And thank you all so much.
The victims.
Say that again?
The victims of the police brutality cases, not the defendants.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I said defendants. I meant police brutality victims. I apologize. Yeah, absolutely. But I am honored, so honored to have been talking with all 4 of you for the last hour and a half now. Thank you again so much for your time, and thank you all who have tuned in to listen to us. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
You. You too. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Go defund the police.
Defund the police.